O heavenly King, comfort of the Spirit of truth, who art everywhere present and fillest all things. Treasure of blessings and giver of life, come and abide in us and cleanse us from every impurity. Save our souls. Amen. So we're on 25. Okay, you want to read?
Step 25. On the destroyer of the passions, most sublime humility, which is rooted in spiritual perception. He who thinks that it is possible to use a visible world in order to ascribe the awareness and effect of the love of the Lord exactly, holy humility gracefully, blessed purity truly, divine enlightenment clearly, the fear of God honestly, or assurance of heart unerringly, and imagines that by his description of things of this kind he will enlighten those who have never actually experienced them, is like a man who by words and comparisons wants to give an idea of the sweetness of honey to people who have never tasted it. But just as the latter talks in vain, not to say babbles, so the former either gives the impression of having no experience of what he is talking about, or else has become the mere toy of vainglory. This subject sets before us a touchstone, a treasure preserved in earthen vessels, that is to say, in our bodies, and it is of a quality that baffles all description. This treasure has an inscription, which is incomprehensible because it comes from above, and those who try to explain it with words give themselves great and endless trouble. And the inscription runs thus: Holy Humility. Let all who are led by the Spirit of God enter with us into the spiritual and wise assembly, holding in their spiritual hands the God-inscribed tablets of knowledge. When we have come together, we have investigated, and we have probed the meaning of this precious inscription. And one man said, humility means constant oblivion of one's achievements. Another, it is the acknowledgement of oneself as the last of all and the greatest sinner of all. And another, the mind's recognition of one's weakness and impotence. And another again, in fits of rage, it means to forestall one's neighbor and be first to stop the quarrel. And again another, recognition of divine grace and divine compassion. And again another, the feeling of contrite soul and the renunciation of one's own will. But when I had listened to all this and had attentively and soberly investigated it, I found that I had not been able to attain the blessed perception of that virtue which, from what has been said. Therefore, last of all, having gathered what fell from the lips of those learned and blessed fathers as a dog gathers the crumbs that fall from the table, I too gave my description of it and said, humility is a nameless grace in the soul, its name known only to those who have learned it by experience. It is unspeakable wealth, and a name and gift from God, for it is said, learn not from an angel, nor from man, nor from a book, but from me, that is, from my indwelling, from my illumination and action in you. For I am meek and humble in heart and thought and in spirit, and your souls shall find rest from conflicts and relief from thoughts. The appearance of this holy vine is one thing during the winter of passions, another in the spring of fruit blossom, yet another in the actual harvest of the virtues. Yet all these different stages concur in gladness and fruit-bearing, and therefore they all have their own signs and sure indications of fruit to come. For as soon as the cluster of holy humility begins to blossom within us, we at once begin, though with an effort, to hate all human glory and praise, and to banish from ourselves irritation and anger. When this queen of virtues makes progress in our soul by spiritual growth, we regard all the good deeds accomplished by us as nothing, or rather as an abomination, supposing that every day we add more and more to our burden by a dissipation that we do not comprehend. We suspect the very abundance of the divine gifts showered upon us to be beyond our deserts and to aggravate our punishment. So our mind remains unplundered, reposing securely in the casket of modesty, only hearing the knocks and jeers of the thieves, without being subject to any of their threats, because modesty is an inviolable safe. Thus we have ventured in a few words to philosophize about the blossoming growth of this ever-flourishing fruit. But what is the perfect reward of this holy virtue? You who are near to the Lord must ask the Lord himself. It is impossible to gauge the quantity of this holy wealth, and to explain its quality is still more impossible. However, as regards its distinguishing characteristics, we must try to express the thought that comes to our mind. Painstaking repentance, mourning cleansed of all impurity, and holy humility in beginners are as different and distinct from each other as yeast and flour from bread. By open repentance the soul is broken and refined. It is brought to a certain unity. I will even say a commingling with God by means of the water of genuine mourning. Then, kindled by the fire of the Lord, blessed humility becomes bread, and it is made firm without the leaven of pride. Therefore, when this holy threefold cord, or rather heavenly rainbow, unites into one power and activity, it acquires its own effects and properties, and whatever you name as an indication of one of them is a token also of another. And so, by a brief demonstration, I shall try to prove what I have just said. The first and paramount property of this excellent and admirable Trinity is the acceptance of indignity with the greatest pleasure. When the soul receives it with outstretched hands and welcomes it as something that relieves and cauterizes diseases of the soul and great sins. The second property is the loss of all bad temper and humility at its subsiding. The third and highest degree is a true distrust of one's good qualities and a constant desire to learn. Christ is the end of the law and the prophets, for righteousness to everyone that believeth. And the end of the impure passions is vainglory and pride for everyone who is inattentive. But their destroyer, the spiritual stag, keeps him who lives with it immune from all deadly poison. For where can the poison of hypocrisy appear in humility? Where is the poison of calumny? Where will a snake nestle and hide? Will it not rather be drawn out of the earth, like of the heart, and be killed and destroyed? In union with humility, it is impossible that there should be any appearance of hatred, or any kind of dispute, or even a sniff of disobedience, unless perhaps the faith is called in question. He who has been united with humility as his bride is above all gentle, kind, easily moved to compunction, sympathetic, calm, bright, compliant, inoffensive, vigilant, not indolent, and why say more, free from passion. For the Lord remembered us in his humility and redeemed us from our enemies and our passions and impurities. A humble monk will not meddle with mysteries, but a proud one will pry into judgments. The demons praised one of the most discerning brothers, appearing to him in visible form. But this most wise man said to them, "If you cease to praise me through the thoughts of my heart, I shall conclude from your departure that I am great. But if you continue to praise me, from your very praise I shall guess my impurity. For every proud-hearted man is unclean before the Lord. And so either go away from me, and then I shall become great, or else praise me, and through you I shall obtain more humility." Struck with bewilderment, they immediately vanished from sight. May your soul not be a pond on the life-giving stream, a pond which is sometimes full and sometimes dried up from the heat of glory and exaltation, but may it become a fountain of dispassion, ever welling up into a river of poverty. Know, beloved, that the valleys shall abound with wheat and spiritual fruit. This valley is a soul low and humble among the mountains. That is, it is filled with labors and virtues, and always remains unhaughty and steadfast. David did not say, "I have fasted, I have kept a vigil," or "I have lain on the bare earth," but "I humbled myself, and straightway the Lord saved me." Repentance raises the fallen, mourning knocks at the gate of heaven, and holy humility opens it. But I affirm this, and I worship a Trinity in unity and a unity in Trinity. All visible things get their light from the sun, and all that is done according to reason gets its force from humility. Where there is no light, everything is dark. Where there is no humility, all that we have is rotten. In the whole universe there is one place that has only once seen the sun, and there is one thought which has often given birth to humility. And there was one day on which the whole world rejoiced, and there is one virtue only which the demons cannot imitate. It is one thing to exalt oneself, another not to exalt oneself, and another to humble oneself. One person may be judging others all the day long, another does not judge others, but he does not condemn himself. A third, though he is innocent, is always passing judgment on himself. It is one thing to be humble, another to strive for humility, and another to praise the humble. The first belongs to the perfect, the second to the truly obedient, and the third to all the faithful. He who has humbled himself within will not be cheated by his lips, for what is not in the treasury cannot be brought out through this door. A horse when alone often imagines that it is galloping, but when it is with others it finds out how slow it is. It is a sign of the beginning of health when our thought no longer prides itself on its natural gifts, but as long as it has that stench in its nose, it cannot detect the fragrance of myrrh. Holy humility said, "My lover will not rebuke or judge or rule or display his wisdom until he has attained union with me, for when he is united with me, the law is no longer applicable to him." The foul fiends whispered praises into the hearts of an ascetic who was striving for blessed humility, but by divine inspiration he contrived to conquer the guile of the spirits by a pious ruse. He arose and wrote on the wall of the cell the names of the highest virtues in order, that is, perfect love, angelic humility, pure prayer, inviolable chastity, and others like these. And so when the thoughts of vainglory began to praise him, he said to them, "Let us go and be judged." Then going to the wall, he read the names and cried to himself, "When you possess all these, then you will know how far you still are from God." We cannot describe the power and essence of this sun, humility, but from its properties and effects we can explain its intrinsic nature. Humility is a divine shelter to prevent us from seeing our achievements. Humility is an abyss of self-abasement, inaccessible to any thief. Humility is a tower of strength against the face of the enemy. No advantage shall his enemy have over him, nor shall the sun, or rather the thought, of iniquity avail to hurt him any more, but he will hew down his enemies before his face, and them that hate him shall he put to flight. Besides all the distinguishing properties indicated above, the great possessor of this wealth has others in his soul, and all these properties except one are visible signs of this wealth. You will know in yourself and not be led astray that you have this holy possession within you by an abundance of unspeakable light, by an unutterable love for prayer, and before this is attained, by a heart that does not judge the faults of others. And the precursor of what has been said is hatred of all vainglory. He who has come to know himself by discerning each feeling of his soul has sown on earth, but those who have not thus sown cannot expect humility to blossom forth. He who has come to know himself has obtained an understanding of the fear of the Lord, and he who has walked by the aid of this fear has reached the door of love. Humility is the door of the kingdom that introduces those who draw near to it. And I think that the Lord was speaking of this door when he said, "He shall enter and shall pass out of life without fear, and shall find pasture and green grass in paradise. All who have entered the monastic life by any other door are thieves and robbers of their own life." We who wish to understand must not cease to examine ourselves. If in the perception of our heart we consider that our neighbor excels us in all things, then divine mercy is near us. It is impossible for snow to burst into flame. Still more difficult is it for humility to dwell on an unorthodox person. This is something that the pious and faithful achieve, and then only when they have been purified. Most of us call ourselves sinners, and perhaps really think it, but it is indignity that tests the heart. He who is hastening to that tranquil harbor of humility will never cease to do all that he can, and will drive himself on by words and thoughts and afterthoughts and various means, by investigations and researches, and by his whole life, by prayers and supplication, meditating and reflecting, and using all imaginable means until, with God's help and by abiding in humiliations in the most despised conditions and by toils, he delivers the ship of his soul from this ever-recurring storms of the sea of vainglory. For he who was delivered from this sin is easily forgiven all the rest of his sins, the publican in the gospel. There are some who all their lives use the bad deeds previously done by them, and for which they have received forgiveness, as a motive for humility, thereby driving out their vain self-esteem. Others, having in mind Christ's passion, regard themselves always as debtors. Others hold themselves cheap for their daily defects. Others, as a result of their besetting temptations, infirmities, and sins, have mortified their pride. Others, for want of graces, have appropriated the Mother of Graces. There are also people, if they still exist, who, for the sake of the very gifts of God and the measure that they receive them, humble themselves and so live as to account themselves unworthy of such wealth, and each day add to their debt. Such is humility, such is beatitude, such is the perfect reward.
Okay. Do we have any questions or comments up to this point?
Can you explain number 33, Vladika?
33?
Yeah.
Well, we call ourselves sinners, and we think that we're sinners. But the real test of it is when somebody puts us to indignity,
Okay.
and we're called on our stuff.
Okay.
And so we can have that outward form of humility, but when it comes to being really put to the test, is that humility really within us?
So like being criticised.
Being criticized, being called a hypocrite, and having your hypocrisy pointed out, all that kind of stuff.
So number 11 says, a humble monk will not meddle with mysteries, but a proud one will pry into judgments.
Mm-hmm.
Could you kind of expound on that?
Well, I mean, those who... I think one of the most important things is that, there are boundaries to our ability to understand. And here he's essentially given this long, apophatic argument why humility is something ultimately beyond our comprehension. And so a humble monk won't try and explain things that can't be explained, but a proud one will try and explain everything, and will try and explain the unexplainable. Prying into the judgments of God, it says also the ways of God is a more direct translation, and we can't know the ways of God. One of the great strengths of the Orthodox Church is that we have that the affirmation of the limits of our ability to rationally comprehend theology. And it's wise to keep those barriers.
Would you say part of the tradition of humility in the church, like you read in a lot of stories and anecdotes about people being falsely accused and not trying to defend themselves? Mm-hmm. Would you say that's more of like something those with a special grace to handle that would maybe be more inclined toward, or is that maybe something we could look for in our own lives?
Well, I think it's something that we need to strive for in our own lives, whatever our state of life, whether married or monastic or otherwise. In other words, to not react when we're judged and criticized and slandered, and so that's the ideal. But are we willing to do that? Do we have to come back at somebody who has offended us? And do we seek vengeance and retribution? Our culture isn't a culture that understands forgiveness, for example, but it's also a culture that it doesn't have the least concept of humility. It's all about assertion of my rights, or now it's my feelings, what I want, and there's no humility in that.
So maybe like if we're falsely accused for a crime, that's one thing, mm-hmm. But like if somebody is slandering us and accusing us of some moral thing, it's like a matter of humility to like know how things really are in mm-hmm. God's eyes and not let it affect you.
Yeah, just let them talk. Empty words.
Children don't have humility, do they?
They have to be pretty small.
Wait a second. Bigger you are, less humility.
Well, yeah, I mean, at St. Herman's we have this whole herd of little 2-year-old boys. And one of them has just discovered the word no, which he loudly proclaimed in the midst of the congregation multiple times. And that's not exactly what one would call humility. But he has no ego, so that means.
But it does work humility for the parents.
Yeah. It takes a lot of humility for the parents. What else?
Number 18.
What?
Number 18. Could you explain the last part about like passing judgment, always passing judgment on himself?
Mm-hmm. One person may be judging others all the day. Another does not judge others, but he does not condemn himself. A third, although he is innocent, is always passing judgment on himself. In other words, there's no humility in somebody who's passing judgment on people all the time. But there's also, he's lacking humility who, he may not pass judgment on others, but he also doesn't condemn himself for his own shortcomings. And on one hand you could say, you could interpret it that he's saying that there's, you see humility in somebody who's continually judging himself, except it's false. And
is there a
that's
term
a
for
and then
that?
it's a pretense. So that I would say that that's as much of a trap as the other two, quite frankly.
Is there a term for that? I think in Russian it's samobichovание. When you, like, all the time.
Yeah.
I don't think there is a term in English, do you? You know?
Well, it's not hypocritical, but it's not honest. It's not real.
Yeah, it's lying, first of all.
Yeah, exactly. And that's not what humility. There's no humility in a falsehood.
So is it like judging based off one's own standards or their own kind of values?
As most often it's vainglory, trying to look humble in the eyes of other people.
Would you say that despair is showing a lack of humility in the sense of like having faith in God?
Yeah, there's in despair. I mean, you're totally focused on yourself. So, yeah, there's no humility in despair.
So when they say like self-condemnation, it's more like discerning and recognizing your own sins than it is just a despair of, and then I'll never be able to overcome this.
Well, yeah, and if you give up like that, then that's not helpful either. That's certainly not a virtue. If it becomes a passion of self-pity to accuse yourself of all sorts of sins, and then think, well, I can never overcome these sins, and so I'm not even going to try, and just give up. And all that is self-pity, which is vainglory. Kind of turned on its head. But to accuse oneself honestly of sins, and to know that it's true, and for it to be true, that's the right track. And if there are sins, and to say that you're sinless, that's a lie. So I think honesty and and truth are really part of the fundamental aspects of humility.
You don't accuse yourself in public. It's already like a show up if you accuse yourself in public.
Well, yeah, for most people, if you walk into church during liturgy and say, I'm the greatest of sinners, oh, I did this, and I did that, and I did this, and look at me, and poor me, and on. And you're creating a show. I think that's why the church got rid of public confession.
What would you say in the sense like the saints and elders, from our perspective, they're
Sorry.
You're gonna end up on your back.
God willing.
From like our perspective, they are like the most sinless of us all. But when we hear them talk about themselves, they are saying the opposite.
Right. The mark of the great elder would be for him to truthfully believe and say, I'm the greatest of all sinners.
But it's not like he's being dishonest in the sense he's making up sins that he hasn't committed.
No, he's seeing his own shortcomings. Shortcomings that are so subtle that we couldn't even imagine them. Because the more mature you get spiritually, the meaning of sin changes. Because you're not doing like major physical sins, you're not beating somebody up, you're not lusting after, you're not doing all this kind of stuff, but things become much more subtle. And so sin moves from being, transgression of, the Ten Commandments, like the big stuff, to transgression in the spirit, to loss of awareness of God, and distraction from God. And that's very subtle. And if you're trying to live a hesychast kind of life in which you maintain constant, unbroken conscious awareness of God, and every distraction from that is sinful, or is a sin, it's an entirely different thing than somebody who hasn't even begun to get themselves under control.
I've heard the image of like looking out a dirty window versus looking out a spotless window, applied to how like us versus like the saints would see sin, because like we're looking through a dirty window and it takes kind of like a big object to like stand out from the rest of the dirt, but with them it's like they're looking out at such a clean window that every minor speck would be noticeable. So when I heard that, it kind of like made sense.
Yeah. Although when we start out, we're not looking through a dirty window. We're looking through a window that's been painted over, and maybe there's a fleck or two that's letting some light through.
Right.
Anything else on this before we go on?
I guess a general topic in the sense
Sure.
of like this is it's so easy to have like false humility. How do you kind of safeguard and have true humility? Like I can fast and keep vigil. It's like Prophet David's like I humbled myself, but how is it like focusing and being aware of like we're doing this for our sins, opposed to just doing them because I have to do this now because.
Well, a good place to start is to be absolutely honest with yourself in terms of your sin, and don't exalt yourself, and don't. But also, it's also not allowing vainglory to get in there either. So that you walk in and your cassock is all tattered and you've got the fragrance of holiness, which is stale sweat and incense, kind of around you like a cloud, and your hair, and you've got hair is all matted and your beard is all matted and I'm so holy. It's like I used to drive the brothers, and that's what I used to say. Yep, Halloween, 365 days a year. It's not about that. It's about the truly humble person is a person who loves, and loves in great honesty, and and puts the other first, and is aware of his own shortcomings, and will admit his own shortcomings and not judge anybody else. And that's there's multiple aspects to humility. But it's not. There's one abbot that I know said, "Well, if it looks right and it smells right, it is right, right?" No. As St. Maximus says, being a monk is not about being a monk outwardly. It's about being a monk inwardly. And if you're not a monk inwardly, then you're just plain dress up, and there's no salvation in that. So it's, you know, and so part of it is just being very, you know, being right there for other people, but you know, in love and in compassion, but you don't make a spectacle of yourself. It's like, oh, look at what how good a Christian I'm being. I'm Mr. Good Samaritan. Hey. That doesn't work. So, yeah, I mean, some of those are easy traps to fall into, and some of them are a little harder.
Mm-hmm.
So, does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So shall we go on?
When you see or hear that someone has in a few years acquired the most sublime dispassion, then conclude that he traveled by no other way than by this blessed shortcut. A holy team is love and humility. The one exalts, and the other, supporting the exalted ones, never fails. Contrition is one thing, self-knowledge is another, humility is another. Contrition is the result of a fall. He who falls is crushed, and he stands in prayer without boldness, but with praiseworthy audacity, as one who is shattered, steadying himself with the staff of hope and using it to drive off the hound of despair. Self-knowledge is a true idea of one's spiritual growth and an unbroken remembrance of one's slightest sin. Humility is Christ's spiritual doctrine, noetically introduced into the inner chamber of the soul by those who are counted worthy of it. It cannot be defined by perceptible words.
That's the real point of this chapter. It can't be defined.
He who says that he fully feels the fragrance of such myrrh, yet feels, when praised, even a momentary movement of the heart, or understands the force of the words, that man, let him not make no mistake about it, is already mistaken. Not unto us, O Lord, not unto us, but unto thy name give glory. I heard someone say with heartfelt conviction, for he knew that human nature cannot ordinarily abide in praise without loss. My praise is from thee in the great church, that is, in the future life, and before that I cannot accept it without danger to myself. If the limit and rule characteristic of extreme pride is for a man to feign such virtues as he does not possess for the sake of glory, then it follows that a sign of the deepest humility will be to abase ourselves by pretending to have faults that we do not possess. It is in this way that we have behaved, it is in that way that he behaved who took into his hands bread and cheese. Likewise, the exponent of purity who took off his clothes and said, free of passion went through the whole city. Such men take no account of the fact that they are a cause of offense to men. They have received power through prayer to reassure all men invisibly, but he who is anxious about the former will show a lack of the latter. When God is prepared to attend our prayer, then we can do anything. It is better to offend men than God. God rejoices when he sees us running to meet dishonor, so as to crush, strike, and destroy our vain self-esteem. Such feats are the effect of flight from the world carried to the highest degree, for only the truly great can bear derision from their own people. Do not be surprised at what is said, for no one can climb a ladder in one stride. By this all men know that we are God's disciples, not because the devils are subject to us, but because our names are written in the heaven of humility. The natural property of the lemon tree is such that it lifts its branches upwards when it has no fruit. But the more the branches bend down, the more fruit they bear. Those who have the mind to understand will grasp the meaning of this. Holy humility obtains from God the power to bear fruit 30-fold, 60-fold, and 100-fold. The dispassionate attain to the last degree, the courageous to the middle, and all can rise to the first. He who has come to know himself is never tricked into undertaking what is beyond him, but keeps his feet safely on the blessed path of humility henceforth. Birds fear the sight of a hawk, and those who practice humility fear the sound of dispute. Many have received salvation without prophecies and revelations, without signs and wonders. But without humility no one will enter the marriage chamber, because humility is the guardian of these gifts, and without her they will bring frivolous people to ruin. For those of us who do not wish to humble ourselves, the Lord has arranged in His providence that no one can see his faults as well as his neighbor does. So we are bound to give thanks for our healing, not to ourselves, but to our neighbor and to God. The man of humble mind always loathes his own will as erring, and in his petitions to the Lord with unwavering faith, he learns what he should do and he obeys. He does not direct his attention to the life of his teachers, but casts his care upon God, who used an ass to teach Balaam his duty. Although a worker of this kind does everything and thinks and speaks according to the will of God, even so he will never trust himself. Self-confidence for the humble is just as much a thorn and a burden as another man's choice is for the proud. It seems to me that it is the property of an angel not to be seduced by sins. For I hear an earthly angel say, I know nothing against myself, yet I am not hereby justified. But he that judgeth me is the Lord. Therefore we should unceasingly condemn and reproach ourselves, so as to cast off involuntary sins through voluntary humiliations. Otherwise, if we do not, at our departure we shall certainly be subjected to a harsh rendering of account. He who asks God for less than his desert will certainly receive more than he deserves. This is demonstrated by the publican who asked for forgiveness but received justification. And the robber only asked to be remembered in his kingdom, but he inherited all paradise. It is impossible to see fire by nature, small or great, in any creature. And it is absolutely impossible that anything of a material nature should be found in sincere humility. As long as we fall into voluntary sins, there is not this humility in us, and that is a sign that there is still something material in us. The Master, knowing that the virtue of the soul is modeled on outward behavior, took a towel and showed us how to walk the way of humility. For the soul becomes like its bodily occupations. It conforms itself to its activity and takes its shape from them. Authority served as a ground for arrogance for one of the angels, although that was not why it was conferred on him. He who sits on a throne has certain dispositions, and he who sits on a dunghill has others. And that is perhaps why that great saint sat on the dunghill outside the city. For then, when he had obtained perfect humility, he said with deep feeling, I abhor myself and melt away, and I esteem myself dust and ashes. I find that Manasseh sinned as no other man has sinned by defiling the temple of God with idols and contaminating all the divine worship. If the whole world had undertaken a fast for him, it could have made no return for this. But humility had power to remedy even what was incurable in him. If thou hadst desired sacrifice, I would have given it, says David to God, but thou wilt not be pleased with whole burnt offerings. That is, with bodies consumed by fasting. the sacrifice for God, and everyone knows what follows. I have sinned against the Lord. Blessed humility once cried to God after committing adultery and murder, and he soon heard, the Lord hath put away thy sin. The ever-memorable fathers laid down that the way to humility and its foundation is bodily toil, but I would say obedience and honesty of heart, because they are naturally opposed to self-esteem. If the pride of some of the angels made them demons, no doubt humility can make angels out of demons. Wherefore let those who have fallen take courage. Let us hasten with all our powers to fight our way to humility's head. Failing this, let us at least mount on her shoulders, and if our effort is not sufficient for this, let us at least not fall out of her arms. For I hardly think a man who falls out of them will receive any eternal gift. The sinews of humility and its ways, but not its attributes, are poverty, hidden withdrawal from the world, concealment of wisdom, simplicity of speech, asking of alms, hiding of nobility, banishment of familiarity, exclusion of loquacity. Nothing can so humble the soul as a state of destruction and a beggar's subsistence. For we only prove to be philosophers and lovers of God when, having the possibility of exaltation, we flee from it irrevocably. If you take up arms against some passion, take humility as an ally, for she will tread upon the asp and basilisk, that is, sin and despair, and will trample upon the lion and dragon, that is, the devil and the dragon of the body. Humility is a heavenly siphon from which the abyss of sins can raise the soul to heaven. Someone saw in his heart the beauty of humility, and seized with amazement asked her to tell him the name of her parent. Smiling joyfully and serenely at him, humility replied, "How is it you are in a hurry to know the name of my parent? He is nameless, and I cannot tell you until you possess God. To him be the glory unto the ages. Amen." The mother of the fountain is the deep sea, and the fountain of discernment is humility.
Okay. No questions.
There was a sentence said that it's better to offend a man than God. What is the difference?
Well, the context of that was that it's better to offend God than your spiritual father, because if you offend God, at least you have your spiritual father to intercede for you with him, and to acquire forgiveness for you.
No, it said it's better to offend a man than God. I forgot to. I mean.
Well, I think that was one context. This other context, I don't remember seeing that in here.
44 and 45 is the context.
Ah.
Thank you.
Okay, well, in the context, last verse of 44, God is prepared to attend to our prayer. When God is prepared to attend to our prayer, then we can do anything. And then 45, and God rejoices when when he sees us running to meet dishonor, in other words, accepting dishonor, slander, so forth, which crushes our vainglory and conceit. We get grace from God. We don't get grace. we don't receive grace from men. Even when we go to confession, we're still receiving the grace of absolution from God, not from the priest. It's through the priest, but not from the priest, because it's God's grace. I'm not sure how else to explain that. Because there's an antinomy.
Would you say that humility is being used here in a way that, like, wisdom is kind of used in Proverbs? Humility is, it's like a knowledge, but it's also a state of being. It's something that you do.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe you could explain, like...
I think you did a pretty good job.
Well,
Wisdom and humility are related. There's no humility without wisdom. And true wisdom is all about humility. But, wisdom, the Old Testament anyway, wisdom is even personified.
mm-hmm.
And in a sense, you could say humility is personified in Christ and in the saints, in the Word of God. Jesus certainly is the personification of humility, but that's he's the personification of all of the virtues.
So it's a unity of being humble and also having humility as knowledge, as wisdom, something that's acquired.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately it's passing from gaining wisdom and gaining humility to being humble and to being truly humble and truly wise, to be into the state of being, whereas it takes time to get there. It takes practice, and it takes being humbled.
Yeah, it just kind of reminded me of wisdom, because you can be wise, but there's really not a sense in which we would say someone is wise unless they actually have wisdom.
Right.
And that's only attained through long process of purification. Right. And it seems like humility is the same.
It's the same. The two are very closely related, I would say. Does that sound right?
Yeah.
What else?
Um, 57 says, "It is impossible to see fire by nature, small or great, in any creature. And it is also impossible..." And that's the one that starts. Could you... that beginning kind of confused me.
Yeah, it does me too.
Okay.
What number is it?
57.
57.
I think he's... I don't think he's referring to material fire, ultimately. But it's odd. It's a. I don't know. Well, okay. So shall we go to 26? Yeah. Uh-huh.
I was wondering what is the proper response when someone praises you for anything?
Well,
Thank you.
yeah,
That's it.
probably the best is thank you and just don't say anything and don't think anything.
Who's praising
Unless
you?
maybe, well, you're deluded. Or, sure, right. That doesn't go, that kind of, there's no humility in sarcasm either.
I would say feigned humility never works for me.
No.
Is it possible for one to be humble and praise others? Or is that kind of contradictory?
That's kind of contradictory.
So we shouldn't compliment people?
Well, I think it's. And there's certain kinds of compliments that are fine, you know, that aren't going to elicit. It's another thing. It's another thing to be, you know, to butter somebody up and to, you know, to be a sycophant. That's one thing where it's all, you know, you're telling people lies to make them think that they're, you know, that like our politics is all about that.
It's okay to tell your wife that she looks good today.
Yeah, I would think so. I mean, if you don't want to be sleeping on the couch, probably. It's a good thing.
Just remembered one of my favorite compliments that I heard was, "You look better." It's like, ooh. And someone at church told me about that one being told to them, and I was like, oh.
Yeah. Well, there's all sorts of ways of doing backhanded compliments like that, where it's a real backhand.
And, you know, in Scripture, God compliments people in a sense. You know, compliments John the Baptist. No one born among women is greater than John.
Well, I don't think he said it to his face.
Yeah. So,
I don't think he came up to Jesus came up to John and said, "No one born among women is greater than you are."
so maybe there's a difference between praising someone like in general as a means of edifying others, like with the saints.
Well, he was also teaching, and in a sense, yeah, he was praising. He was praising John, but he was also simply stating a fact. You know, to say to your wife, "Oh, you look good today." Well, well, it made it, you know, it made it's. And she's laying there dying, you know, and you know, you look good today, you know. That's fun. Or she's all dressed up and ready to go out to dinner to a party. Well, you look good today. You know, that's another thing. So, are those about trying to build up her ego, or is it about just a personal affirmation?
So it's like it would be okay for me to tell my coworker like they did a good job on something.
Yeah.
Okay.
If he did.
But like
to
if
say,
I,
well,
but if
you're
I
the
notice
greatest
like,
plumber who's ever lived, I don't know.
well, if I notice like some virtue in somebody, should I point it out to? I shouldn't point it out to them. And just kind of like let it be.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, you're really wise. Don't do that.
Mm-hmm.
What if they aren't Orthodox?
Don't do it.
Well, then say what's appropriate. You know. But you don't have to say. I would think you're really wise, except you're certainly going to hell because you're not Orthodox. So, and that doesn't work either.
So I'm not allowed to announce anathemas.
No.
Yeah, probably.
Not a good idea.
Best look.
Well, shall we say 26? 26 is long.
Very. Yeah, I was flipping through. It's 30 pages.
Yeah.
I remember getting stuck on this one.
Yeah?
Yeah. I was reading it before this class.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's get a little bit into it.
Step 26 on discernment of thoughts, passions, and virtues. Discernment in beginners is true knowledge of themselves. In intermediate souls, it is a spiritual sense that faultlessly distinguishes what is truly good from what is of nature and opposed to it. And in the perfect, it is the knowledge which they have within by divine illumination, and which can enlighten with its lamp what is dark in others. Or perhaps, generally speaking, discernment is and is recognized as the certain understanding of the divine will on all occasions, in every place, and in all matters. And it is only found in those who are pure in heart, and in body, and in mouth. He who has piously destroyed within him the three passions has destroyed the five too. But he who has been negligent about the former will not conquer even one passion. Discernment is undefiled conscience and purity of perception. Let no one on seeing or hearing something supernatural in the monastic way of life fall into unbelief out of ignorance. For where the supernatural God dwells, much that is supernatural happens. Every satanic conflict in us comes from these three generic causes: from negligence, or from pride, or from the envy of the demons. The first is pitiable, the second is most wretched, but the third is blessed. After God, let us have our conscience as our mentor and rule in all things, so that we may know which way the wind is blowing and set our sails accordingly. In all our actions in which we try to please God, the demons dig 3 pits for us. By the first, they endeavor to prevent any good at all from being done. By the second, after their first defeat, they try to secure that it should not be done according to the will of God. But when these rogues fail in this too, then, standing quietly before our soul, they praise us for living a thoroughly godly life. The first is to be opposed by zeal and fear of death, the second by obedience and humiliation, and the third by unceasing self-condemnation. We shall be faced by toil of this kind until the divine fire enters into our sanctuary. For then our proclivities are rendered powerless. Our God is a consuming fire, is a fire consuming all fever of lust and movement of passion, every inclination rooted in us, and all blindness and darkness within and without, both visible and spiritual. The demons, on the other hand, produce in us the opposite of what has just been said. For when they take possession of the soul and extinguish the light of the mind, then there is no longer in us poor wretches sobriety, or discernment, or self-knowledge, or shame, but there is indifference, insensibility, want of discernment, and blindness. What has just been said is known very vividly by those who have abandoned fornication and become chaste, who have curbed their freedom of speech and have changed from shamelessness to self-possession. They know how, after the sobering of the mind, after the ending of its blindness, or rather its maiming, they are inwardly ashamed of themselves for what they said and did before when they were living in blindness. If the day in our soul does not draw to evening and grows dark, then the thieves will not come and steal and kill and destroy our soul. Theft is loss of property. Theft is doing what is not good as if it were good. Theft is unobserved captivity of the soul. The slaying of the soul is the death of the rational mind that has fallen into nefarious deeds. Destruction is despair of oneself, following on breach of the law. Let no one plead his incapacity to fulfill the commandments of the gospel, for there are souls who have gone even beyond the commandments, and you will certainly be convinced of what has been said by him who loves his neighbor more than himself and laid down his life for him, although he had not received this commandment from the Lord. Let those who have been humbled by their passions take courage, even if they fall into every pit and are trapped in all the snares and suffer all maladies. Yet after their restoration to health they become physicians, beacons, lamps, and pilots for all, teaching us the habits of every disease, and from their own personal experience able to rescue those who are about to fall. If some are still dominated by their former bad habits and yet can teach by mere word, let them teach. But they should not have authority as well. For perhaps being put to shame by their own words, they might begin to practice virtue, and there come to pass in them that which I saw with certain men who were stuck in the mud. Bogged down as they were telling the passers-by how they had sunk there, explaining this for their salvation, so that they should not fall in the same way. However, for the salvation of others, the all-powerful God delivered them from the mud as well. But if those who are possessed by passions voluntarily plunge into pleasures, let them teach by silence. For Jesus began both to do and to teach. Perilous, truly perilous is the sea that we humble monks are crossing, a sea in which there are many winds, rocks, whirlpools, pirates, waterspouts, shallows, monsters, and waves. A rock in the soul we may consider to be fierce and sudden anger. A whirlpool is hopelessness which seizes the mind and strives to drag it to the depths of despair. A shallow is ignorance which accepts what is bad as good. A monster is this heavy and savage body. Pirates are the most dangerous servants of vainglory who rifle our cargo and the hard-won earnings of the virtues. A wave is a swollen and burdened stomach which by its greed hands us over to the beast. A waterspout is pride that casts us down from heaven, that carries us up to the sky and then down to the abyss. Those engaged in education know what studies are suitable for beginners, what for the intermediate, and what for teachers. Let us take sensible precautions not to prolong our study and stop in the beginner's lessons. For to see an old man going to a children's school is a great disgrace. Here's an alphabet for all. I don't know Greek letters too.
Just read the words.
Okay. Obedience, fasting, sackcloth, ashes, tears, confession, silence, humility, vigil, courage, cold, toil, hardship, humiliation, contrition, forgetfulness of wrongs, brotherly love, meekness, simple and unquestioning faith, freedom from worldly cares, hateless hatred of parents, detachment, innocent simplicity, voluntary abasement. A good schedule and resolution for the advanced and evidence of their progress is an absence of vainglory, freedom from anger, good hope, stillness, discernment, firm remembrance of the judgment, compassion, hospitality, moderation in reproof, dispassionate prayer, lack of avarice. And here is a standard, rule, and law for those who in the flesh are piously aiming at perfection in spirit and body: an unfettered heart, perfect love, a well of humility, a detached mind, an indwelling of Christ, inviolability of the light of prayer, an abundance of divine illumination, a longing for death, a hatred of life, flight from the body, an intercessor for the world, a forcer of God, a fellow worshipper with angels, an abyss of knowledge, a house of mysteries, a keeper of secrets, a savior of men, a god of the demons, a lord of the passions, a master of the body, a governor of nature, a banishment of sin, a house of dispassion, with the Lord's help an imitator of the Lord. We have need of considerable vigilance when the body is sick. The demons, seeing us laid low and temporarily incapable of entering into the struggle with them owing to our infirmity, try to attack us fiercely at such times. The demon of irritation and sometimes of blasphemy hovers around those living in the world in times of illness, and the demon of gluttony and fornication attacks those living outside the world if they have an abundance of all necessities. But if they are living in ascetical places bereft of all consolation, then the tyrant of despondency and ingratitude is constantly sitting with them. I noticed that the wolf of fornication added to the sufferings of the sick, and during their actual sufferings produced in them movements of the flesh and emissions. And it was astounding to see how the flesh rages and burns with desire amidst violent agonies. And I looked again and saw men lying in bed who were then and there comforted by the divine power or by a sense of compunction. And by this comfort they warded off the pain and reached such a frame of mind in which they never wanted to get rid of their sickness. And again I turned and saw those suffering severely who by illness were delivered from the passions of their soul as if by some penance. And I glorified him who cleansed clay by clay. A noetic mind is certainly wrapped in noetic perception, since it is both in us and not in us. Let us never cease to seek it. When it makes its appearance, the outward senses of their own accord cease their natural action. Knowing this, one of the wise said, "And thou shalt obtain a perception of the divine." The monastic life in regard to deeds, words, thoughts, and movements must be lived with heartfelt perception. Otherwise, it will not be a monastic life, let alone an angelic life. The providence of God is one thing, His help is another, and His protection another. The mercy of God is another, and His consolation another. Providence is displayed in all nature, help only in the faithful, protection in the faithful who truly have faith, mercy in those who serve God, and consolation in those who love him. Sometimes what serves as a medicine for one is poison for another, and sometimes something given to one, the same person at a suitable time, serves as medicine, but at the wrong time it is a poison. I have seen an unskilled physician who, by subjecting to dishonor a sick man who was contrite in spirit, only drove him to despair. And I have seen a skilled physician who operated on an arrogant heart with a knife of dishonor, and drained it of all its evil-smelling pus. I have seen one and the same sick man sometimes drink the medicine of obedience, and move, walk, and not sleep in order to cleanse his impurity, and sometimes, when the eye of his soul was sick, remain still and silent. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. Some, I know not why, for I have not learned to pry conceitedly into the gifts of God, are by nature, I might say, prone to temperance, or stillness, or purity, or modesty, or meekness, or contrition. But others, although almost their own nature itself resists them in this, to the best of their power force themselves, and though they occasionally suffer defeat, yet as men struggling with nature, they are in my opinion higher than the former. Do not boast, man, of the wealth you have obtained without labor, for the bestower, foreseeing your great hurt and infirmity and ruin, at least saves you to some extent by those unmerited gifts. Instruction in childhood, education, and studies either help or hinder us in virtue in the monastic way of life when we come of age. Angels are light for monks, and the monastic life is a light for all men. Therefore let monks strive to become a good example in everything, giving no occasion for stumbling in anything in all their works and words. For if the light becomes darkness, how much darker will be that darkness, that is, those living in the world. If you will listen to me, you who are willing to do so, it is better for us not to diversify ourselves and divide up our poor soul in doing battle with thousands and thousands and 10,000s of 10,000s of enemies. For it is not in our power to comprehend or even to discover all their hosts. With the help of the Holy Trinity, let us battle with 3 against 3. Otherwise we shall make much toil for ourselves. If he who turneth the sea into dry land really abides in us, then our Israel too, that is, the mind that beholds God, will certainly cross this sea untossed, and will see the Egyptians sunk in the waters of tears. But if he has not yet made his abode in us, who will stand the roaring of the waves of this sea, that is, of our flesh? If through our activity God arises in us, his enemies will be scattered, and if we draw near to him by divine vision, those who hate him will flee from before his face and ours. Let us try to learn divine truth more by toil and sweat than by mere word, for at the time of our departure it is not words but deeds that will have to be shown. Those who hear of treasure hidden in a certain place seek it, and having discovered it, take trouble to keep what they have found. But those who get rich without trouble readily squander their possessions. It is difficult to overcome former bad habits, and those who keep on adding further new ones to them either fall into despair or get no benefit at all from obedience. But I know that to God all things are possible, and to him nothing is impossible. I think we could stop there.
Sure. Any questions?
Could you maybe expand a bit on 25?
Computer.
Yeah, actually, just as with physical medicines, they work differently at different times in different people. So you have to discern with correction and with rebukes and things like that. What's going to benefit somebody or what's going to drive them into despair. And sometimes you can't tell. So there's always a matter of discernment as to what to say when somebody's really struggling or really hurting. Because you don't want to exacerbate a situation. You know, if somebody's struggling with self-hatred and self-loathing, you don't want to give him certain kinds of spiritual literature because it'll drive him into suicide. But for somebody who's so full of himself that he needs to have his ego deflated, maybe that same spiritual literature will be a help to him. But you have to have enough discernment to understand, to know the person as well as what would be the right medicine to administer. It's also, it says in the Psalms, rebuke a wise man and he'll become so wise, or rebuke a fool, and you'll only get dishonor. So
reminds me a little bit of in Wounded by Love of Porphyrios. He was like, well, when I started out as a confessor, I gave out these really draconian penances that had been just what I had inherited, but then it starts to, well, people can't do this. Right. This isn't helping them.
Right.
And so these were established for good reason at some time, but in the pastoral circumstances, that's not what's going to heal them. So I find that just really, beautiful and an expression of God's mercy.
Well, it is, and it's a very, it's very true. That sometimes sometimes a penance can just totally backfire, and it'll create an obsession instead of getting instead of helping the person to put that sin or passion out of his mind. You have to be very careful. So that's also one of the pitfalls of some of these young priest monks at some of the monasteries, that they have no education, and so they can't contextualize the canons, and nobody ever told them that they're not laws, and they're not applied as laws, but rather it's kind of a maximalist guideline.
Yeah.
And so instead they apply them like laws. Well, and the result is it drives people into despair, and it drives them away from the church. And so that totally backfires. Let's pray. It is truly meet to bless thee, Theotokos, ever blessed and most pure, and the Mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, more glorious beyond compare than the seraphim. Without corruption, thou gavest birth to God, the Word. True Theotokos, we magnify thee. The blessing of the Lord be upon you through his grace and love for mankind, always now and ever, to the ages of ages. Amen.